I was standing in the middle of my parents' living room when the floor began to tilt, slowly at first, like the house was breathing wrong. My tongue felt thick in my mouth. I tried to say my sister's name, but the word came out broken, slurred, not fully mine. The right side of my face went numb, then my arm, like it no longer belonged to me. I knew, with a clarity that cut through the panic, that something was terribly wrong. "Please," I whispered, forcing the word past lips that wouldn't obey me. "Call 911!" Evelyn turned toward me with a sharp sigh, the kind she used when she thought I was being inconvenient. "Stop making a scene," she snapped. "You're not dying, Margaret. You're just trying to get attention." My vision blurred. I reached for my phone on the side table, but she was faster. She yanked it out of my hand and placed it face down on the far end of the coffee table, just out of reach. "Don't," she said to our mother without even looking at her. "She's faking it. She's trying to ruin this. Ignore her." I looked around the room, at my aunts and uncles, at cousins I barely recognized, all of them watching me sway where I stood. No one moved. No one reached for a phone. My knees buckled, and as I fell, the last thing I saw was my sister standing over me, arms crossed, while the entire family watched me hit the floor. I didn't know it then, but an emergency room doctor would later say 6 words that would silence every single one of them. The hardwood was cold against my cheek. I could feel it clearly, even as the rest of my body stopped making sense. My mouth moved, but no sound came out. I tried to lift my arm, any arm, and nothing happened. Panic surged, hot and suffocating, but underneath it was something worse. Recognition. This wasn't fainting. This wasn't stress. This was my brain failing me in real time. Above me, voices overlapped in fragments, stretched and distorted like I was underwater. Someone cleared their throat. Someone muttered my name, uncertain, as if saying it might obligate them to act. I stared at the ceiling light, watching it smear into 2, then 3, fighting the urge to close my eyes because some instinct deep inside me screamed that if I did, I might not open them again. I turned my gaze toward my mother. She was standing a few feet away, her hand half raised, her face twisted in something like confusion. For one brief second, I thought she would step forward. I thought she would remember that I was her daughter. Then she looked at Evelyn instead. Evelyn gave a small, impatient shake of her head. My mother's hand dropped to her side. That moment hurt more than the numbness creeping up my neck. It hurt more than the terror flooding my chest, because I understood then that this wasn't hesitation. It was permission. She was waiting to be told whether my life was worth interrupting the afternoon. The room felt smaller, tighter. My breathing turned shallow and uneven. I could feel my heart pounding, not fast, but wrong, like it had lost its rhythm. I wanted to scream, to pound the floor, to force someone to see me, but my body refused every command I gave it. I was conscious, trapped inside myself, aware of every second sliding past while no one helped. I had known this room my entire life. I had sat on that couch as a child, as a teenager, as an adult daughter who learned early how to stay quiet and useful. I had never felt so alone inside it. Time stretched in strange ways. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt endless. Someone shifted in their chair. Someone else looked away, uncomfortable, as if my stillness was an accusation. No one touched me. No one knelt down. No one said the word ambulance. A sudden sound cut through the fog, sharp and out of place. The front door opening. Footsteps. Quick. Purposeful. "What on earth is going on in here?" a woman's voice demanded. I couldn't turn my head, but I felt the shift in the room immediately. This voice didn't carry irritation or judgment. It carried alarm. I saw a pair of shoes step into my line of sight, then a face leaning down toward me, eyes wide with horror. "She needs help," the woman said. "Right now." "That's Helen," someone murmured, as if naming her explained everything. Helen Moore, my father's neighbor, his friend. She took in the scene in a single glance. Me on the floor, my phone out of reach, a room full of people standing around like spectators. She didn't ask questions. She didn't look to my sister. She pulled out her phone and dialed. 911, she said clearly. "We have a woman on the floor with stroke symptoms, slurred speech, paralysis. She needs an ambulance immediately." Evelyn protested, her voice tight with irritation. "She's exaggerating. She always does this." Helen didn't even turn around. "You can explain that to the paramedics," she said. "If you're wrong, those minutes matter." The room erupted into movement then. Too late. I felt hands hovering near me, unsure, useless. The sound of sirens began faintly in the distance, growing louder, closer. Relief washed over me, followed immediately by grief so sharp it made my chest ache. I hadn't been saved by my family. I had been saved by someone who wasn't supposed to love me at all. As the darkness began to creep in at the edges of my vision, one thought surfaced, clear and heavy. My father would have known this would happen. Somewhere, deep down, he must have known. The first clear thing I remember after the sirens was the sound of my own breathing, loud and mechanical, like it didn't belong to me. It came in through a mask strapped to my face, forced and steady. I opened my eyes to bright hospital lights and a ceiling I didn't recognize. For a moment, I didn't know where I was or how I had gotten there. Then I tried to move my right hand, and it didn't move the way it should have. Memory rushed back in fragments, sharp and unforgiving. Lying there, half numb and exhausted, a single thought settled over me with an awful calm. What happened on that floor hadn't been an accident. It was the result of a pattern that had been set long before my body failed me. I had been trained, slowly and thoroughly, to disappear. Growing up, there was always a story my family told about my sister, Evelyn. She was the baby who almost didn't make it, born too early, too small, wrapped in wires and warnings. Doctors had spoken in careful voices. My mother had lived in fear for weeks, convinced she would lose her. When Evelyn survived, that fear didn't fade. It hardened into something permanent, something that shaped the rest of our lives. Evelyn became precious, fragile, watched. I became the other one. I was the child who didn't cry much, who figured things out on her own, who learned early that praise came easier when you didn't need anything. When I fell and scraped my knee, I was told to brush it off. When I brought home good grades, they were expected. When Evelyn struggled with something small, the house reorganized itself around her feelings. My mother used to smile proudly and say, "Margaret's so strong, she doesn't need much." At the time, I thought it was a compliment. It took me years to understand it was a dismissal. There were rules in our house that were never written down but always enforced. Don't complain. Don't compete. Don't take up space that might belong to Evelyn. If she was upset, everyone rallied. If I was hurt, I learned to handle it quietly. Needing help was a kind of failure, and I didn't want to be a burden. By the time we were teenagers, the roles were set. Evelyn spoke with confidence, interrupting adults without hesitation. People listened. I waited my turn, even when no one noticed I was waiting. If something went wrong, I fixed it. If something needed doing, it somehow became my responsibility. Reliability became my defining trait, and reliability, I learned, was invisible. I told myself it would change when we grew up. I believed adulthood would level the ground, that effort would matter more than image. I believed that if I gave enough, if I stayed kind and useful and accommodating, my family would eventually see me clearly. That belief followed me like a promise I kept renewing, even as it failed me over and over again. As adults, the pattern didn't disappear. It refined itself. Evelyn was still the center of attention, still the one whose presence was praised rather than her effort. I became the one who handled logistics, who filled out forms, who made calls, who stepped in when something needed to be done quietly and correctly. When people talked about family devotion, they talked about how visible Evelyn was. They didn't talk about the work that happened when no one was watching, and I didn't correct them. Part of me thought that speaking up would make things worse. Another part of me had simply grown used to the silence. It felt safer to absorb the disappointment than to risk being accused of jealousy or bitterness. Evelyn had always been protected. I had always been expected to cope. That was why, when my body started sending warning signs months before the stroke, I ignored them. Dizziness, headaches, moments when the room seemed to tilt for no reason. I told myself I was tired. I told myself I was stressed. I told myself I didn't have time to be sick. When I mentioned it once, casually, my mother barely looked up. "You always overthink things," she said. "You're fine." So I stopped mentioning it. Lying in that hospital bed, I finally saw the connection clearly. On the floor of that living room, my family hadn't frozen because they didn't understand what was happening. They froze because they had never learned how to respond to my pain. In their minds, I was the strong one, the capable one, the one who would be okay. Evelyn's voice carried authority because it always had. When she said I was making a scene, it fit the story they preferred. When she told my mother not to call for help, my mother listened because she always had. No one questioned it because questioning Evelyn had never been part of our family's language. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the weight of that realization settle in my chest. The betrayal on that floor hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been rehearsed for decades, shaped by every moment I had stayed quiet to keep the peace. A nurse came in to check my vitals, speaking softly, carefully. I focused on her voice, on the way she looked at me directly when she asked how I was feeling. It was such a small thing, but it felt unfamiliar in the best way. Being seen without having to perform. As she adjusted the IV, I thought about the moment before I collapsed, the way I had looked at my mother, still hoping. I understood now that hope had never been based on evidence. It had been based on who I wished they were, not who they had shown me themselves to be. Somewhere down the hall, I heard voices, doctors speaking in calm, professional tones. I didn't know yet what they would say, or how much damage had already been done. But one thing was clear to me in a way it had never been before. What happened to me wasn't just about a stroke, it was about a lifetime of being taught that my needs were optional. And, lying there, alive by chance and by a neighbor's courage, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time, I wasn't wondering how to make my family see me. I was wondering what it would mean to finally stop trying. By the time my father's illness became impossible to ignore, caring for him had already slipped into my life as naturally as breathing. There was no family meeting, no discussion about who would take responsibility. It simply became understood that I would be the one who showed up. Robert Livingston had always been precise, even as the cancer began to take things from him one by one. His appetite went first, then his strength, then long stretches of his voice. What remained was his awareness. He noticed everything. I learned to read the smallest changes in his face, the way his eyes would linger when he was in pain or when he needed something he couldn't quite articulate. I took unpaid leave from work without announcing it to anyone. I rearranged my schedule around doctor appointments and medication times. I learned which pills had to be taken with food and which ones made him nauseous if he moved too quickly afterward. I stayed overnight on the nights his breathing scared me, listening to the rhythm of it in the dark, counting each rise and fall of his chest. In the mornings, when he was strongest, I sat beside his bed and read to him. Not novels, financial news, market summaries, articles about companies he used to advise before retirement. It made him feel like himself again, like the man who had built a career on understanding systems and risk. He couldn't always respond, but sometimes his fingers would tighten around mine, a silent thank you. No one else saw those moments. Evelyn visited too, of course, but her visits were brief and carefully timed. She arrived when our mother was home or when relatives happened to stop by. She stood close to my father's bed, smiled for photos, held his hand just long enough for someone to notice. Her phone was always in her hand, angled just right. After 20 minutes, maybe 30, she would sigh and mention an appointment she couldn't miss. "I wish I could stay longer," she'd say loudly, for the benefit of whoever was listening. "But you know how busy things are." My mother would nod sympathetically. "She sacrifices so much," she would say, squeezing Evelyn's arm. "She really does." I would be in the kitchen, washing medication cups, or in the hallway on the phone with the pharmacy, and no one would look my way. At first, the praise didn't bother me. I told myself it didn't matter who got credit. What mattered was that my father was comfortable, that he wasn't alone. But as weeks turned into months, something sour settled in my chest. The story being told about our family didn't match the reality I was living. Evelyn was becoming the devoted daughter in everyone's mind, and I was becoming an afterthought. I heard the whispers when relatives visited. "Evelyn's been incredible," an aunt murmured once, glancing around the room. "She's always here." I was standing 3 feet away, holding a tray of pills. I didn't correct them. I smiled and kept moving. It wasn't until later that I understood how dangerous that silence was. My father noticed, though. He noticed everything. On evenings when it was just the two of us, he would look at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, as if he were trying to memorize my face. One night, when I finished reading an article aloud and started to stand, he tightened his grip on my hand. "I see it," he whispered. His voice was weak, but his eyes were sharp. "All of it." I didn't know what he meant. I assumed he was talking about the care, the time, the effort. I smiled and told him to rest. I had no idea that, by then, he had already begun to see something else entirely. As his condition worsened, subtle changes appeared around the house. Papers were reorganized. Files were moved from drawers to a locked cabinet in his study. He asked me to bring him documents he hadn't touched in years. Old statements, account summaries, legal folders I barely remembered existed. I thought it was part of preparing for the end. People always talked about getting their affairs in order. I didn't question it. Evelyn, however, began asking questions. They sounded harmless at first. "Do you know where Dad keeps his investment records?" she asked one afternoon, leaning against the counter as I poured water into a kettle. "I just want to help, you know." Help with what? She didn't specify. Another time, she mentioned that it might be smart to streamline things, to make sure someone had access in case of emergencies. She spoke as if access were a given, not something that needed to be discussed or earned. I felt a flicker of discomfort, but brushed it aside. This was my sister. Why would I suspect her? My father grew quieter during those weeks, more watchful. He never confronted Evelyn. He never said her name in connection with the paperwork. Instead, he scheduled meetings that I didn't attend. Phone calls he took alone. When I asked if everything was okay, he told me it was handled. I believed him. The truth was, I didn't want to imagine conflict. I was already carrying enough. I told myself that families didn't turn on each other when someone was dying. I told myself that whatever I was sensing was exhaustion talking, not intuition. Looking back now, I understand how carefully he moved, how deliberately he chose silence. He wasn't avoiding the problem. He was measuring it, preparing for it. On the day he told me the plan for the asset announcement, his voice was steadier than it had been in weeks. He said he wanted everyone together. He said it would be simpler that way. I nodded, assuming it would be emotional but uneventful. A formality, a closing chapter. I didn't know that he wasn't planning an ending at all. He was setting a trap, and I walked toward it believing, foolishly, that the hardest part was already behind us. I began to notice the change in my father, the way you notice a shift in weather. Subtle at first, easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. He asked sharper questions. Not emotional ones, not nostalgic ones, but precise questions about accounts, timelines, and access. It was as if a switch had flipped inside him, returning him to the man he had been before illness forced him to slow down. One afternoon, while I was helping him adjust the pillows on his bed, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, then at me. "Can you give me a minute?" he asked softly. I stepped into the hallway, thinking nothing of it. I could still hear his voice through the door, low and controlled. It wasn't the voice of a man confused or frightened. It was the voice of someone concentrating. When I came back, he didn't explain the call. He didn't need to. He simply asked me to bring him a box from the study later that evening. Inside were files I hadn't seen in years, old investment statements, legal documents neatly labeled in his handwriting. He flipped through them slowly, methodically, as if confirming something he already suspected. At the time, I assumed this was about legacy, about making sure nothing was left unresolved. Cancer has a way of forcing people to face details they once postponed. I told myself that was all it was, but there was something else in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. Over the next few weeks, I watched him grow quieter, not weaker. He scheduled meetings with his lawyer that I didn't attend. When I offered to sit in, he shook his head. "Not this one," he said. "I've got it." There was a calm certainty in his tone that made me back off. What I didn't see then was that he had made a decision not to confront anyone, not to accuse, not to argue. He didn't raise his voice or demand explanations. He chose something far more dangerous. He chose to document. That choice went unnoticed by most of the family, but not by Evelyn. Her questions shifted from vague curiosity to unsettling specificity. She asked about account numbers, about whether certain investments were still active, about how quickly things could be transferred, if necessary. She spoke as if she were brainstorming solutions, as if access were a formality that had somehow been overlooked. I felt a flicker of irritation the first time she mentioned it. "Dad's handling that," I said carefully. She smiled, unbothered. "Of course," she replied. "I just want to be prepared." Prepared for what? She never said. My father listened when she spoke. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct her. He simply watched, his expression unreadable. Later, when we were alone, he reached for my hand and held it longer than usual. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Some people confuse access with entitlement," he said quietly. I laughed, thinking it was an abstract comment, something philosophical. I told him he sounded tired. He didn't smile. He just squeezed my hand once, then closed his eyes. That was the moment I should have understood, but understanding requires a willingness to imagine betrayal, and I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I focused on practical things: medication schedules, insurance forms, household bills. I remained what I had always been: reliable, unquestioning. I didn't realize that my father was using that time, my quiet efficiency, as cover. While everyone assumed I was managing care, he was managing risk. The bank called again a few days later. This time, he took the call in front of me. I caught a few words. Attempted access. Flagged. Not authorized. His face hardened, then smoothed over as the call ended. He thanked the person on the other end and set the phone down with deliberate care. Is everything okay? I asked. Yes, he said. Now it is. He didn't tell me what had happened. Not then. Not later. I learned afterward that someone had tried to use an old power of attorney document to access one of his investment accounts. The transaction had been stopped by the bank's safeguards. At the time, all I knew was that something had crossed a line, and my father had noticed. What he did next was not impulsive. It was meticulous. He arranged independent medical evaluations to confirm his mental capacity. He updated legal documents with witnesses who had no connection to our family. He asked his lawyer to prepare contingencies, instructions that would activate only if certain things happened. He kept copies of everything, dated and filed. And through all of it, he said nothing. I mistook that silence for exhaustion. I told myself he didn't have the energy for conflict. I didn't realize that silence was his way of controlling the battlefield. He wasn't avoiding a fight. He was choosing when and where it would happen. When he finally told me that he wanted the asset plan announced at the house, I was surprised. It felt intimate, almost sentimental. I thought he wanted familiarity, a sense of closure. I agreed without hesitation. It seemed harmless. Evelyn was pleased. I could tell by the way she immediately offered to help organize things, to arrange seating, to make sure everyone could attend. She spoke as if the outcome were already decided, as if the announcement were a ceremony honoring her. My father listened and nodded. He thanked her. He even smiled. That smile haunted me later. In the days leading up to the announcement, I noticed how carefully he conserved his energy, how he watched the room when people spoke, how his gaze lingered on Evelyn when she assumed authority, on my mother when she deferred. He was observing patterns he had likely seen for years, patterns I had lived inside without questioning. I thought the announcement would be an ending. A painful one, maybe, but necessary. I believed the hardest part was behind us. I didn't know that what he was planning wasn't an ending at all. It was a reckoning. And I walked toward it unaware, carrying my old assumptions with me, never imagining that the truth he had been quietly assembling would soon collide with my body, my silence, and a living room full of people who had no idea how close they were to losing control. I woke that morning with a dull pressure behind my eyes, the kind that made the world feel slightly off-center. When I sat up in bed, the room tilted for a second before settling again. I waited, breathing slowly, telling myself it was nothing. I had learned over years how to negotiate with discomfort. Ignore it long enough, and it usually backed down. I told myself I just needed to get through the day. I dressed carefully, moving slower than usual, pausing when the lightheadedness returned. My reflection in the mirror looked normal enough. No drooping face, no obvious weakness. I drank water, skipped breakfast, and reminded myself that my father needed me steady. There would be lawyers, relatives, expectations. This was not the day to be dramatic. By the time I arrived at the house, the pressure in my head had grown heavier, like someone was pressing down on my skull with both hands. The living room was already arranged when I walked in. Chairs in neat rows, the coffee table cleared, the air tight with anticipation. It felt less like a family gathering and more like a ceremony. Evelyn was there already, standing near the front of the room, directing people with small gestures and confident smiles. She looked composed, energized, as if she had been waiting for this moment. When she saw me, her eyes flicked over me briefly, then away. No greeting, no concern. I took a seat toward the side, telling myself it didn't matter where I sat. As long as I stayed out of the way, things would go smoothly. The dizziness returned without warning, stronger this time. The room lurched sideways, and I grabbed the arm of the chair to steady myself. My vision blurred at the edges, colors smearing together. I blinked hard, tried to focus on a fixed point on the wall. Something was wrong. I opened my mouth to speak, to say I needed a minute, but the words tangled before they reached my lips. My tongue felt thick, uncooperative. Panic surged, sharp and immediate, cutting through every instinct I had to stay calm. I stood, intending to excuse myself, and nearly fell. The room seemed to tilt sharply, like the floor had dropped out from under me. A strange numbness crept up the right side of my body, first my hand, then my arm. I stared at it, willing it to move normally. It didn't. This isn't stress, I thought. This isn't anxiety. I turned toward my mother, toward anyone, really, and forced the words out as clearly as I could. "Please," I said, "call 911. For a fraction of a second, the room went quiet. Then Evelyn laughed, short and sharp. "Oh, come on," she said. "Stop making a scene." I shook my head, trying to stay upright. "I can't," I slurred. "I need help." She stepped toward me, irritation flashing across her face. "You are not having a stroke," she snapped. "You're doing this because you want attention. You're trying to delay this because you know what's coming." I reached for my phone on the side table, my fingers clumsy, barely obeying me. Before I could grab it, Evelyn was there. She yanked it out of my hand and placed it face down on the far end of the table. "Don't," she said firmly, turning to our mother. "She's faking it. She always does this when things aren't about her. If you call an ambulance now, you'll ruin everything." I looked at my mother, my heart pounding in my ears. She hesitated, her face tight with uncertainty. For one terrifying moment, I believed she might still help me. Then she looked at Evelyn and did nothing. Something inside me cracked then, a sharp, painful break that had nothing to do with my body. The realization hit harder than the dizziness. They weren't confused. They weren't scared. They were choosing. My knees buckled. I tried to catch myself, but my legs no longer felt like they belonged to me. I collapsed onto the hardwood floor, the impact jarring and cold. My cheek pressed against the wood, and I lay there, stunned, unable to push myself up. I tried to speak again. No sound came out. The numbness spread, swallowing my face, my tongue, my limbs. My breathing turned shallow and uneven, each breath a conscious effort. I stared at the legs of chairs, at shoes shifting uncomfortably, at the hem of Evelyn's pants as she stood over me, arms crossed. "She just wants to sabotage this," she announced to the room. "Ignore her." Someone cleared their throat. Someone else looked away. No one knelt down. No one reached for a phone. Time stretched into something unrecognizable. Seconds dragged. My vision narrowed, darkening at the edges. I could feel my heart beating, slow and wrong, like it was losing its rhythm. Fear surged through me, raw and overwhelming. I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of surviving like this. Trapped, damaged, silent. I tried to lift my arm again. Nothing happened. I tried to turn my head. Nothing. My mind was sharp, painfully alert, fully aware of every second slipping away while the people who knew me best stood and watched. They were willing to let my brain die to protect their narrative. I don't know how long I lay there. It could have been minutes. It felt like hours. The room was filled with the low murmur of discomfort, the sound people make when they want a problem to resolve itself without their involvement. Just as the darkness began to creep closer, just as my awareness started to fracture, I heard a new sound. Footsteps. Quick. Purposeful. The front door opened, and a voice I didn't recognize cut through the room, sharp with alarm. "What is going on in here?" I held on to that sound like a lifeline as everything else began to fade. The voice didn't belong to anyone in my family, and that was how I knew it mattered. It cut through the haze in my head, sharp and urgent, slicing past the murmurs and excuses that had filled the room while I lay on the floor. "What is going on in here?" I couldn't turn my head, but I saw shoes step into my narrowing field of vision. Sensible shoes. Moving fast. A woman bent down beside me, and her face came into focus just long enough for me to register the shock in her eyes. "Oh my God!" she said. "Margaret." Helen Moore, my father's neighbor, his friend, the woman who had checked on him more times than I could count when my hands were full. "She needs help," Helen said immediately, her voice rising. "Why is she on the floor?" Before anyone could answer, she saw my phone on the table, face down and out of reach. She saw the way my mouth moved without sound. She saw the way one side of my body lay useless against the floor. Her expression changed from confusion to something harder. "She's having a stroke," Helen said. "Why hasn't anyone called 911? Evelyn scoffed. "She's exaggerating. She's been dramatic all morning. She's trying to—" Helen didn't even look at her. She pulled her phone from her pocket with shaking hands and dialed. 911, she said clearly. "I need an ambulance immediately. Adult female, mid-30s, slurred speech, paralysis on one side, sudden collapse. Yes, we're at—" She gave the address. She didn't ask permission. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't entertain debate. Something shifted in the room the moment she made that call. The air changed. Authority entered, and it wasn't Evelyn's anymore. "What are you doing?" my mother asked weakly. "What none of you would," Helen snapped. "She needs medical attention now." I felt a strange mix of relief and grief wash over me. Relief that someone was finally helping. Grief that it hadn't been my family. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder by the second. People began to move then, suddenly aware of their own inaction. Someone knelt near me, unsure what to do with their hands. Someone else brought a pillow, as if comfort were the issue. Evelyn stood rigid, her arms uncrossed now, her confidence cracking. The paramedics arrived in a rush of red lights and clipped commands. They moved with practiced efficiency, kneeling beside me, asking questions I couldn't answer. One of them shone a light into my eyes. Another checked my vitals. "She's in neurological distress," one said. "Possible ischemic stroke." "How long has she been like this?" another asked, looking up at the room. No one answered. Helen did. "Several minutes at least," she said steadily. She asked for help. They didn't call. The paramedics exchanged a look. One of them wrote something down. I was lifted onto a stretcher, straps tightened across my chest and legs. Oxygen was placed over my face. The ceiling rushed past as they wheeled me out of the house. The last thing I saw before the ambulance doors closed was Helen standing in the driveway, her face set with determination, while my family clustered behind her, small and silent. The ride to the hospital came in flashes, voices calling out numbers, the steady beep of a monitor, the weight of my own body pressing into the stretcher. I drifted in and out, fighting to stay present, afraid that if I let go completely, something essential would slip away with me. When I woke again, I was in a hospital bed, the room dim and quiet, except for the steady rhythm of a machine marking my heartbeat. Tubes ran from my arm. My head throbbed. I tested my fingers, relief flooding me when they moved, slowly but surely. A doctor sat in a chair near the bed, reviewing a chart. He looked up when he noticed my eyes open. "Margaret," he said gently. "I'm Dr. Harris. You had an ischemic stroke. We got to you in time, but it was close." "Close!" The word echoed in my mind. He explained what had happened in simple terms. A disruption of blood flow, a window where treatment mattered, minutes that made the difference between recovery and permanent damage. If the ambulance had arrived any later, he said carefully, the outcome could have been very different. I nodded, tears slipping silently down the sides of my face. There's something else you should know, he continued. Everything about your arrival today has been documented. The delay, the symptoms, the witness statement from the woman who called for help. That record exists now. I didn't fully understand what that meant yet, but I saw something in his eyes then. Not pity, anger, controlled, professional, but unmistakable. Later, Helen told me what happened while I was being stabilized. Dr. Harris had found my family in the waiting area. Evelyn was there, arms crossed, her foot tapping impatiently against the floor. When he asked her to step into the hallway, she did, her face already arranging itself into concern. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He looked at her steadily and said 6 words that would follow her for the rest of her life. She nearly lost her brain because of you. Evelyn tried to argue, tried to explain, tried to minimize. He stopped her with a single raised hand. In stroke cases, he said, every minute matters. She asked for help. You interfered. That's not drama. That's medicine. When he returned to the waiting room, he addressed everyone. When someone asks for emergency medical help, he said, you call 911 immediately. What happened today should never happen again. No one spoke. Lying in that hospital bed, listening to Helen recount his words, I felt something settle into place inside me. For the first time, the truth didn't belong to my family's version of events. It belonged to a medical record, a timeline, a witness. For the first time in my life, the silence around me had been broken by someone with authority, and it was written down. By the time I was discharged from the hospital, my body was still fragile, but my mind had never felt clearer. My speech came slowly, carefully, and my balance wavered if I stood too long, yet there was a steadiness inside me that hadn't existed before. I had survived, and survival had shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. The call from my father's lawyer came the morning after I returned home. His voice was calm, almost gentle, as he explained that my father had anticipated delays and complications. The asset announcement would no longer take place at the house. It would happen at his office, in a controlled setting, once I was strong enough to attend. That detail mattered more than I realized at the time. Walking into the law office a week later, I felt every eye turn toward me. I moved slowly, one hand braced against the back of a chair, refusing offers of help I didn't need. I didn't come to prove my strength. I came to tell the truth without raising my voice. Evelyn was already seated across the conference table. She looked composed, dressed carefully, her posture confident. If there was fear beneath the surface, she hid it well. When she saw me, her lips tightened for just a fraction of a second, then smoothed into a polite smile. She still believed this would end in her favor. The lawyer began by explaining that my father had revised his will shortly before his death. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as if each word carried weight. He listed safeguards, witnesses, evaluations, documentation. The room grew quiet as the implications settled in. Then he read the distribution, the house, the investment accounts, the retirement funds. The assets my father had spent his life building were left to me. Evelyn and my mother would receive the minimum required by law, enough to acknowledge them, not enough to reward them. Evelyn stood up so abruptly, her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "That's not possible," she said, her voice sharp with disbelief. He wasn't in his right mind. Everyone knows how sick he was. He didn't know what he was signing. No one moved to support her. The lawyer nodded once, as if he had expected this. Your father anticipated that concern, he said evenly. That is why he obtained independent medical evaluations, confirming his mental capacity. 2 physicians, both certified him competent. Both signed affidavits. Evelyn's face flushed. This is ridiculous, she snapped. She manipulated him. She was always around him. You can't seriously believe? The lawyer raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. There's more. He opened a thick folder and slid a document across the table. Bank records, dates, times. An attempted access to one of my father's investment accounts using an outdated authorization. The transaction had been flagged and stopped. Evelyn stared at the paper, then laughed, a brittle sound that cracked under its own weight. That doesn't prove anything. It does, the lawyer replied calmly. The access attempt was traced, and your father chose not to confront you. Instead, he documented it. The room felt suddenly too small. My mother's hands twisted in her lap. Relatives shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between Evelyn and the lawyer. And finally, he continued, there is the matter of recent events. He placed another document on the table, a sworn statement from Helen Moore, describing what she witnessed the day I collapsed. The words were precise, unemotional, devastating in their clarity. My request for help, the refusal, the phone taken from my hand, the delay. Then came the medical records. The lawyer didn't raise his voice when he explained them. He didn't need to. The facts did the work for him. The documented diagnosis, the timeline.